Hello and welcome to another episode of The Other Side of Sales. I am Ashleigh Early.
And I'm Kasey Jones.
And today we have a topic that's rather, I think, fun. It's kind of near and dear to my heart, and that is the importance of writing. And specifically, especially in this environment, I mean, we're still recording these very topically, very close to release. One of the things I'm noticing a lot with the number of people who are looking for jobs, who are reevaluating their current positions, is now is a time when a lack of comfort, a lack of finesse, a lack of skill when it comes to your ability to write is going to be highlighted, because one of the joys of working remotely is, yes, you can do a ton with video. It's fantastic. This episode will also feature Ashleigh's new puppy, Stanley, who is 8 weeks old. So bonus points for those of you who are watching on YouTube. And those of you who are listening might have to go check out our YouTube channel, which we recently opened, because I'm sure he will be running around in the background making noises at some point. So, but as we get more and more dispersed, it becomes more and more important to make sure you've got those basic writing skills, because even if you're doing a ton of stuff over video, you are still going to have to do a lot more over email, making thorough arguments, figuring out what you need to do, being more persuasive. Before you could pick up the phone, stop by someone's office, you just can't do that as much anymore. So it's really, really important, especially right now, we think.
And not just, keep in mind, it's not just about your communication with prospects. It's also about your communication internally.
Yes.
Because prospects, not that much has changed, right? We're still making calls. We're still doing email in the way that we were. And yes, we're not doing on-site visits. However, you do not have the opportunity to have the same conversations, the same sort of on-the-fly conversations with your fellow colleagues or your bosses or your employees, because you're passing them at work. Everything is going to be written. And that means you need to communicate clearly, otherwise things get confusing. And I think the other thing I'm seeing is that the pace of work has not slowed down.
No.
Anything gets sped up, and that means it can be really tempting to just fire something off really quickly without thinking it through. And that is when that's what leads to miscommunication and to people either not understanding what you are saying or not understanding your intent.
And I'll say this is something that even I consider writing to be one of my strengths. I'm never going to write the great American novel. I have no interest in it, but I'm pretty good at composing an argument. This is something everyone I know who considers himself a good writer, including people who are actually journalists and creative writers, struggle with. So if the people who are professionals struggle with making sure they're understood in the way they intend to be, it means the rest of us really have to step our game up, especially in this environment. And there's a lot of different levels of stepping up your writing. I think what we're going to talk about today and focus more on is kind of the basics, how to make sure you are at kind of the minimum viable threshold to make sure you don't get yourself in trouble.
Absolutely.
With stuff like this. So, and that brings up a really good point. And like I said, I consider writing one of my strong suits, and I'm very fortunate. I was raised by parents who really put a strong emphasis on English skills specifically. My mother is a second-generation immigrant. She grew up speaking 2 other languages before she learned English. And so as a result, as a kid, this is actually a really common thing in sociology and stuff, where the first-generation immigrants teach their children the native tongue, the home language. But then the second generation kids are not taught it because their parents have the memory of, I don't want you to struggle to learn English the way I did. Because English is one of, if not the hardest language to learn. It uses a bunch of different multiple origin languages. So we're the least Latin rooted of the Latin root languages. So we got tons in common with English and Spanish. We got tons in common with Spanish and French and Italian and Romanian, but we're the least of it because we also have a ton of Germanic. We have a ton of Slavic. We have a ton of all sorts of random things in there that leads to a weird amalgamation of not only grammar, but idioms and colloquialisms. And, you'll learn this if you start doing anything international. Even English between Australia and the UK and the US and South in South Africa, or even, Belize, even there, the literal definition of English is slightly different. English is nuts. It's really hard. So first of all, shout out to anyone who is doing sales in multiple languages, and one of those languages is English, because that is not easy. Shout out to anyone where English is not their first language and it's now their daily communication, because that is a level of commitment and dedication that is really impressive in my mind. And at the same time, shout out to anybody who is maybe a native English speaker but acknowledges, I want to be better at this. I know I'm not as good as I think I need to be. I'm not confident in this, because this is something that is absolutely fixable. It's not easy, but with just a little bit of consistency, a little bit of curiosity, this is an absolutely fixable skill gap that everyone should be doing. And because of that, your employers, your buyers, your prospective employers, your coworkers are all expecting you to be at that minimum threshold.
Absolutely. Okay. So we've got a couple of pieces of advice for you. And the number one might be the most obvious.
And yet the hardest.
You want to get better at writing? Write more. And that means writing more in as many different kinds of formats as you possibly can, but with a real emphasis on what is most valuable to you. So if you are in sales, most likely email. Writing really, really great emails is could be your secret weapon. It could be something that helps you really connect with buyers, helps you get that promotion. Because let me tell you, if you're not a decent writer, you probably are not going to rise to a management level.
I know people who have been turned down for positions because of concerns over their writing skills.
Absolutely.
That's absolutely a valid reason that I've seen people be denied promotions for.
Exactly.
And even promotions from SDR to AE as well. I've seen it into management. I've seen it from SDR to AE.
Without a doubt. And
yeah.
SDR to AE, AEs have to write some pretty, especially depending upon what you are selling, they have to write some pretty complex email messages to prospects, and also to their managers, giving updates on a particular deal. And they have to be thorough. They have to be easy to read, easy to understand, but while still formulating a strong argument and hitting the key points. And so you really want to practice this stuff. And one of the things that I think can be most helpful if you are struggling, particularly with some of these lengthier or kind of meatier pieces of content, including emails, is start with an outline.
Yep.
One of the things that I see often is I see people do the thing because they're supposed to do the thing, but without really thinking through why. And oftentimes you'll see someone send an email where you think, what the hell was the point of this email? And that's usually because they haven't taken that first step to think, what am I trying to get out of this? What takeaway do I want the reader to have? And then kind of reverse engineering what the content needs to be. So you can always think through by just slowing down and understanding what is the point of this thing, and then putting together the content. And I would also say, yes, you want to practice this in real life, but also you can role play emails, just like you role play cold calls and conversations and things like that. Work with your colleagues, work with your boss to come up with some sample scenarios where you can put together sample emails and give one another feedback. And this is the kind of thing where you will learn really, really quickly what is working well and where you really need to level up your game.
Yeah, and I'll take it even a step beyond that. If writing an outline feels daunting or feels complex, what are 3 things you want to make sure the person on the other end of the email knows? And this is one of Ashleigh's pro tips for writing. One of the most common ways people dilute their ability to write or mask it is by writing too much.
Yep.
So if you can start with something shorter, the better. And think of it this way. There's a reason why most people consider poetry to be the highest form of a language, regardless of what language you speak. Every language has its own poetry. One of the reasons that is so hard is because it's so few words. It's easy to explain a concept if you've got 10,000 words. It's really hard if you've got 50.
And I would also say, look, there's a ton of great online courses about copywriting.
Yes.
Copy is all about using as little language as humanly possible to not only get your message across, but to compel somebody to do something. And copywriting is probably one of the best skills you can have in business. So I would take a look at some of the free courses out there about copywriting, or even some of the blog content that kind of talks through how to write great copy, and practice those things.
Yep. No, it's really, really true. Everyone should have some basic amount of copywriting ability, even if it's not at the higher level, but you should be able to, like, the biggest thing for me is, I mean, there's a difference between copywriting and proofreading, but that's another big thing. The more you write, the more you proofread, the more you'll copy edit, the easier it will get. And, Kasey made a really good point where it's like, hey, if you're in sales, it's probably email is going to be the medium you're working the most in. There's a lot of talk right now, especially with COVID and everyone working from home and stuff. And Kasey's got some brilliant courses coming out on personal branding and the power of podcasts and all those sort of things. But there's also a lot to be said for practicing writing for social.
Oh, absolutely.
That, which is a whole other skill set. Writing content, writing an article, whole other skill set. And all of these things are things that need to be iterated and built up over time with practice, with care. But it just starts with just doing more of it. It's kind of taking that mindset of, if this scares me, I'm going to do it.
Yep.
And the more you can do that, even just a little bit, pays dividends in the long term. I mean, if you just did a little bit of this every day for 3 months, you'll be 80% of the way there.
Yep.
Honestly. So that brings up to kind of the second pro tip we've got, which is, you're writing more. That's great. That's fantastic. Go find people whose voice or whose style resonates with you. So looking for people who you really like what they're putting up on social, really like how they compose their emails, how they're doing the negotiations, but anyone who you think is doing it well, start getting exposure to what they're doing, whether it's asking an AE who you think is really good at this, if they can BCC you on some emails that they're writing, so you get a sense of how they're doing what they're doing, adding people on LinkedIn whose content you love, A, because you love their content, but B, so you can see how they're structuring it and things like that. But start building out this ability to surround yourself. There's a common adage in learning to write and teaching English courses where they say, expose yourself to as much as you can, read as much as you can. We're tweaking it here because reading business books is not going to teach you how to do business writing. Exposure to this stuff will. So taking your time, curating your LinkedIn, curating your Twitter, curating even your inbox to slowly build this thing up makes a big deal. And it doesn't have to be, this is about finding your voice, not changing you into someone that you're not.
And look, I think part of it is not, yes, like curate those social media feeds, consume more, but also be really thoughtful as you read it. So if you notice that someone's content is really landing for you, and it makes you think, or it makes you want to respond, then get curious as to why. Look through their content and really become almost a student of it, and look at what are the kinds of things that they're saying, what is the language that they're using, what is the format that they're putting it in. Really study it and figure out if you can almost turn it into a formula, a thing, a model that you can follow. And it's not so that you're going to sound exactly like them, but for example, in social posts, like there is a pretty standard formula for the format of a LinkedIn post that's going to do well. And so notice those things so that you can then adopt those and make it your own, and learn from what other people are doing. You can absolutely still test other things, but the whole idea here is to kind of be a student of writing and to really learn what works and what doesn't, what lands and what seems to kind of fall flat.
Yep. And that takes time.
Yeah.
And that's why curating these people who are going to, these authors, these people who you're going to have access to consistently, the more consistently you have access, the easier it'll be to crack that formula versus taking like 1 hour once a week. It's going to take you a lot longer to identify those patterns. And think of it, honestly, I think of this as almost curating your sales script. It's the same process. It's go find 10 people who are doing a good job pitching your product and pick one thing from each of them that you like. And then all of a sudden that becomes your unique voice because no one else would have picked those same 10 things.
Yeah.
So.
And, I think that kind of segues into our third point is also the asking a lot of questions when you are reading these things. And sometimes that's a question of maybe reaching out to someone and be like, hey, I noticed you made this point in this way. I would have done it like this. Why did you do it like that? But it could also mean, oh my God, they use this term that I don't know. I'm going to go look that up. And one thing Ashleigh and I both want to seriously emphasize before you go and you ask someone that you respect or admire about how they did something or why they did it, if it is about a term, Google it first.
Yes, please.
Okay? Do not hit someone up that you sort of respect or admire, asking them to define a term that if you had just taken 15 seconds, you could have found it out on Google. That is not going to lead to a positive conversation with that person. But the whole point here is when you read these things, always find ways to go deeper. So if there's terminology, if there's turns of phrase, if there are points that they're making that you want to better understand, do some investigative work. Go to Google first. Google is your best friend.
Yep.
See if you can find out more about what is the context in which they're using that and really learn there. If you then still have questions about their thought process of putting it together in that way or kind of their approach to it, absolutely send them a LinkedIn message and say, hey, I thought this post you made was really interesting, or this article that you wrote was really interesting. I noticed that you really took this stance and I'm curious as to why. Ask. And a lot of the times, as long as it's a very specific question, people will respond and they will help you figure it out.
And I'll say I've gotten those sort of remarks from people in response to stuff that I've posted or said, and they'll DM me and be like, hey, I really like how you mentioned this point, but I noticed you didn't bring up this side of the argument. And half the time there's a very specific reason from a presenting the argument side of things that I didn't bring that up. And sometimes it's, I didn't think of that. That's a good point. Authors we're all human. We're all figuring it out. But that brings up kind of something else I want to mention really quickly here is writing is two components. One is the actual structure, the grammar, the spelling, those sort of things. The other half of this is actually almost more logic in terms of figuring things out. So making sure you're building a compelling argument and then communicating it properly. If you feel like your grammar's solid, that's the next thing to start building out is the logic and the reasoning side of things, which is a whole other but equally fascinating thing.
Yeah. And one thing too, just to keep in mind with all of this, is if you are crafting an argument, you really always need to keep in mind who you're crafting it for.
Yes.
Because the language that you use, the points that you make are going to be different or should be different if you are talking to a senior executive versus a junior SDR. Because they have different perspectives, they care about different things. The styles and the information that really matter to them are going to be totally different. And so, not to kind of go down a tangent, we're more focused on just the nuts and bolts of writing. But when you are thinking about how to be more persuasive, You need to think about who you're trying to persuade.
Just like pitching.
Just-
It's the exact same thing, but just in a different medium, which you still have to get good at. And I think that's a really good transition too, to kind of the next step, which is the last tip, I think, is leverage technology.
Yeah.
There is a ton of support out there that you can very easily get access to that will help you immediately with your writing. So a couple things we recommend. These are all free. There are upgraded paid versions of them, but these are all free. One is Grammarly. And we'll put links to these in the show notes, but Grammarly is a plugin for Chrome and I think of various other browsers, but it basically is an instant grammar and spell checker.
And it's amazing. And you will learn a ton as you use it. And it's 100% free.
It's really, and I say it's one of the things that's really great about it is it will tell you why the word you used was wrong. Yep. It'll tell you if the tense was off. It'll tell you if there's an idiomatic error. It'll tell you if it's an unnecessary adjective. It'll tell you all of that stuff if you click into it a little bit. One thing to note, if that technology works off of basically reading your screen. So if you were working for a company or in a profile that prohibits screen capture and stuff like that, it will probably block you. There is a paid version that doesn't do that as much. Basically, it's scanning, sending it to a computer, and then presenting things. But it's still super, super, super useful. And if you can't use it on your work computer, I suggest downloading it for your personal computer. Like I said, I've considered myself a pretty good writer and a very good copy editor. It's catching things on me that I would normally need a couple passes to get. And it's even helping me while I'm writing to catch these things. So my edit time is significantly reduced. I cannot say enough about how much I love Grammarly.
And also they've got a really amazing kind of paid version for businesses. So if you happen to know that grammar and kind of spelling issues are pretty common on your team, you might want to talk to your boss about them investing in something like this. It gives them really great oversight into where their team is struggling, and everyone can benefit from it, and it really is not very expensive.
No, so, I know a few inside sales SDR managers who have mandated that everyone on their team has this and even able to expense it because it makes a big difference. Another tool I just discovered is called Hemingway, and this is kind of a whole, this is part of it. This is next level shit. I love it. But basically you can, for free, copy whatever you're writing into Hemingway. It'll apply some advanced grammar stuff in it. Like it'll track how many adverbs you're using, because adverbs have a tendency to be used superfluously in a lot of people's writings, or too many times in people's writings. They'll use adverbs to make it feel bigger than it needs to be. It'll track how many of those you're using and say, hey, you've got a few too many for the length. You might want to go and review a few of these, and it highlights them and it color codes it. It also tells you reading level of what you're writing. So I've found it incredibly useful as I'm developing content in article form to make sure that I don't go too high or too low brow. I'm not using a ton of words like superfluous that are possibly alienating my core audience and stuff like that. It's a really fascinating, super useful tool. It'll also tell you when sentences don't make sense, if you're using the right subjects or sentence structures, too many compound complex sentences, too many simple sentences. It's been absolutely fascinating to look at my own writing in this tool. And I know a lot of other people, when I mentioned this to writers that just discovered this, like, oh yeah, we've been using that forever. I'm like, okay, that's a pretty good endorsement. I just was late to the game on it.
It's especially good if you happen to be wordy.
Yes.
So if you, and frankly, salespeople, we tend to talk a lot. So oftentimes we are saying a lot of unnecessary things in our writing, and it can really help you identify the areas where it makes sense to kind of trim things down, and makes it a little bit easier to make the sort of hard choices of streamlining your writing and getting more to the point of things in a bit of a simpler fashion.
I found it super useful for contentious emails. So where you're really kind of doing more intense negotiations, you're putting proposals back and forth. I found that to be really useful there. for getting it kind of right down to the core points and getting it off, because the more fact-based your writing becomes, the easier it is for things to be misinterpreted.
Yep.
So that's been super useful. And the last thing, and this is something that I've been sending people to for years, anyone who expresses interest in improving this, is Khan Academy has a ton of really great content and coursework around improving writing skills. Everything from, there are a couple levels of grammar classes, there are a couple levels of creative writing classes, of business writing. I haven't been in there in a while, but there's a lot in there. And if you just give yourself a little bit of time right now to jump in and work through some of those, I cannot tell you the impact those courses have made on the people that I've sent to them. It's a huge thing, not just from a skill development that I've seen, but also a confidence level. There are a couple SDRs I can think of who were always very hesitant writing emails. They liked a lot of support, got them doing a couple of these Khan Academy classes, and all of a sudden, not just do they better understand what they're writing, they're better able to write it, but they also are a lot more confident about it, which, as with a lot of things in sales, confidence can hide a multitude of sins.
But no, I think that you make a really good point. It's figure out what you need to learn so that you can build your confidence and you can feel just a little bit better about the work that you absolutely have to do. It can be really tempting to just want to avoid the things that we're not good at. And you don't get better and you don't rise to that next level with that strategy. And truly, if you are early in your career, your writing, if it is not strong, will absolutely hold you back.
Yeah.
So take that initiative, make that investment of your time to get good.
And I'll say this kind of as a last tip, closing thought. There are certain rules of English language that if you get wrong more than twice, is going to take you a long time, if ever, to rebuild trust in. And what I'm talking about here are kind of they're not unforgivable writing sins, but these are things that are frequently called out on social media. They're frequently called out by hiring managers. I have denied people interviews because of seeing too many errors of these types in their resumes, in their cover letters, in their written communication with me. Because if you don't understand these basic things, how can I trust you to do something beyond that? And those are examples like using the right there. Yep. Making sure you understand how to conjugate it's properly, when to use the apostrophe, when not to use the apostrophe. How to punctuate a list, Oxford comma debate aside. Just little simple things like that, just making sure you can clearly articulate how those rules work. If you can articulate the rule, you can use it, you can trust yourself to use it properly. If you don't know how to pick those things, if those things you've heard people talk about it, but you don't exactly know the rule, take 5 minutes when this is over and please go look it up. It is not hard stuff to learn. There are tricks. There are a million of them, but you've got to make sure you again, we're talking about minimum viable level. That's table stakes to get a job.
Absolutely. It shows intention that you've noticed that this matters and you've put the work in to learn it. And if you don't do that, it doesn't, to Ashleigh's point, it's hard for a hiring manager to believe that you're going to put the intention in to do the work that matters at their company.
Yeah. And there's a difference between consistently using the wrong it's and having some autocorrect typos from sending a text on your phone.
Totally.
And people can tell the difference.
Yep.
I mean, Kasey, you were even telling kind of in pre-show talks, you were talking about there was a company that actually, and this is becoming more common, was requiring employees to take a writing test.
Well, and what was interesting about this, and I need to look up the company, this is a few years ago. At the time, it was something like 80% of their employees were developers. And, developers don't really need to do a lot of business writing. And what the CEO said in this interview, because they'd gotten a lot of criticism for having this very harsh grammar test in order to be hired, is what he said is, if you've made it to your 20s or 30s and you've never had the intellectual curiosity to notice that there are 3 spellings of there and want to learn why, then you don't have the intellectual curiosity to write great code and to be a great employee. And that's an extreme example, but that is absolutely what you're kind of up against. Is if it looks like you are just very careless with how you communicate, and you are somebody that is going to be front line and communicating with a company's most important asset, i.e. their customers, why would I put that trust in your hands if you don't take it seriously?
Could not agree more. And I think this already is a common thing in the hiring process. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've submitted countless emails in terms of going through interview processes or playbooks or whatever. This is becoming table stakes.
Yep.
And even beyond that, I think there's an added edge in sales, especially where so much of our job is negotiation, coordination, stuff like that. Getting something wrong over the phone, verbally, Zoom, whatever, it's not the end of the world because it's verbal. It's assumed that things can be misheard, misunderstood, stuff like that. If somebody has something in writing from you, they can hold that over your head forever. So it's especially important if you're doing any sort of negotiation and stuff like that. Putting the wrong "it's" can change the entire nature of a deal. It can take something from a responsibility to a possessive.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it's a completely different conversation. And that could take you either kill the deal outright or take you a long time to rebuild that situation. It's not impossible, but it is a hard thing to do. So it's especially important. It's important to be able to negotiate, but it's important to be able to write these things out, because the moment you put it in writing, if we've learned anything, thanks Mr. Internet, is things live forever once they're written.
Yeah. So do the work, learn how to get better at it, and ask for help.
Yeah.
Ask for another set of eyes to read important things before you send them. And you will get better as long as you apply that intention.
Absolutely. This is not a hard thing to do, but it is something that requires consistency, and it requires that curiosity that we know we all have.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this, please share it with your communities. Please give us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen. Also, keep in mind, we are always open for nominations for people that you think we should interview. And we are also now open for nominations for if you would like to contribute to the Other Side of Sales blog. So we're starting to do more and more of that. We're getting some really great submissions. We would love to feature your writing if you feel pretty confident about it. So hit us up there. It's on the website.
And I'll say this too, when it comes to the content, even if you're not, we've had a few people approach us and we've actually asked them to write content. And they said, oh, I've never written content before. We're happy to work with you.
Absolutely.
If you've got something to say, we would love the chance to help you figure out how to say it right.
Yeah.
That's fun.
And we would actually happily put a video as well. So if there's something that you want to share visually, we've got our YouTube channel. We're happy to put that on the website. We just want to share more stories.
Yeah.
And of course, if you haven't already, go fill out the State of Sales survey. This is all about helping us understand the experience of working in a sales role, and especially the prevalence or hopefully non-prevalence of discrimination, harassment, and the things that make it hard to work on a sales team. So we would love if you would go to othersideofsales.com, fill that survey out, share it with your community. And thank you to the sponsors of the survey, Bravado, VanillaSoft, and the Sales Loft. We are super grateful that you are supporting this initiative.
Yep. And on that note, thank you for listening to another episode of The Other Side of Sales. Tune in next week and we'll talk to you then.